Hello, sixth grade. We are going to start talking about the Civil War this week. I know the last few weeks, you guys have learned about the different compromises that tried to hold our country together. Obviously, they failed. So it led to civil war, North versus the South. Now, in this video, you're only going to learn about Fort Sumter, Bull Run, and Antietam. In the next video, you'll learn about a few more of the battles. Okay, before we get into the Battle of Fort Sumter, we need to talk about Lincoln's election. Lincoln won the presidential election in 1860. The South was very troubled; they were not happy about it. And South Carolina actually becomes the first state to leave the Union on December 20th of 1860 because of this. 6 states would actually leave along with South Carolina. So there was a total of 7 that seceded at first. It was Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By April 17th of 1861, however, there were 4 more states that decided to secede. They were Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And that led to a total of 11 states in the Confederacy. And Jefferson Davis becomes the president of the Confederacy. Can you identify the 11 Confederate states? Look at this map. Look at the numbers. Take a minute. You should be able to identify each of the states on the map. If you can't, make sure you study them. You need to know the Confederate states. When Lincoln won the election in 1860, the South worried that Lincoln would end slavery. The South did not want to lose states' rights. They did not believe in a strong national government. Also, Southern farmers were against the high tariffs that the North wanted because they would increase the price of imported goods. They were also concerned about their relationship with Great Britain and the exportation of cotton. That was the biggest cash crop in the South, the cash crop that led to all the slavery. So they didn't want to lose their ties with Great Britain. There are also some states called border states. These states were allowed to remain in the Union, but were also allowed to keep their slaves. They are the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. They're in red on the map in front of you. West Virginia becomes a state in 1863, and Lincoln let them keep their slaves if they fought for the Union. These were very important states that led to the victory for the North at the end of the Civil War. The first battle was in South Carolina, Fort Sumter. So if you look at the maps in front of you, you can see on the big map to the left, at Charleston Harbor is down in the deep south, down in South Carolina. There's a blow-up map next to it that shows you what the harbor looked like. And Fort Sumter was a man-made island right here at the mouth of the Charleston Harbor. This was a very important fort because there was a lot of traffic coming in and out for trade there. So this fort, actually, when the South seceded, remained part of the Union. And imagine if you were on that island and you had Confederates all around you, Southerners who didn't want you there. It was a pretty intense situation for the people that were on the island of Fort Sumter. The first battle was on April 12th, 1861. Lincoln tried to supply the fort in April. The Confederates basically said, if you send any troops, if you send any supplies, we're going to look at it as an act of war. Well, the people on the island, Major Anderson, he asked for help because they were stuck. They had no supplies. So Lincoln sends message that he's going to send down, some supplies. Well, the Confederates caught wind and they were not happy. They said they gave them, the chance to surrender before this even started. But of course, the Union troops did not want to surrender the fort. So PGT Beauregard, he starts firing on Fort Sumter, and they fire for 34 straight hours, all day, all night. And throughout this bombardment, crazy enough, not one person dies. There's no casualties at all. The fort gets kind of demolished, but nobody dies. Robert Anderson ends up having to surrender because there was nothing he could do. They're on an island in the middle of the water. Um, Here's an interesting fact. Beauregard was actually a student of Anderson's in military school, and they ended up fighting against each other in the first battle of the Civil War. The Union forces were allowed to depart, and they went back up to Washington, D.C. Here's a couple different pictures of depictions of like what happened at Fort Sumter. You have the flag up in the left-hand corner, the one that was flying over Fort Sumter. So, as you can see, it was devastating. I mean, the bombardment was 34 hours long. It's so crazy that nobody died. Here's the telegram from Major Anderson announcing his withdrawal from Fort Sumter on April 18th, 1861. So this is the actual telegram. We found a picture of it. Wanted to share it with you. And here's a picture of what Fort Sumter looked like after the battle, and they cleaned it up some. You can see there's some debris down there, and the walls are kind of crumbling, but they have the Confederate flag flying over it, showing that the Confederates won that first battle. This is a map of what it looks like in the United States at the beginning of the war. Okay, you have your border states, you have your southern states in red, you've got your Union states in green. There's also percentages on there of how many enslaved people were in each state. Now, the first major battle was the Battle of Bull Run, or the First Battle of Manassas. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln called up 75,000 volunteers to defeat the Southern uprising. They thought this was going to be super quick. They would just pull up all these troops, fight, and it would be over. Little did they know it was going to last all the way into 1865. Lincoln sent 35,000 troops from Washington, D.C. to strike Richmond, Virginia, which was considered like the capital in the South. The troops were led by McDowell, and they met 20,000 Confederate troops led by Beauregard, the same Beauregard that was at Fort Sumter, at a river called Bull Run. On July 21st, 1861, this first battle occurred, and it took place near Manassas Junction, Virginia. It was pretty close to Washington, D.C., so it was really important to not let the Confederates get up into Washington, D.C. The Confederates end up winning this battle. All of the troops that were there on both sides were green, which means that they had no experience, so they didn't really know what they were doing. Fortunately for the Confederates, they had a leader named Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and he was amazing. He stood up there like a stone wall, and he got his Confederate troops to use the rebel yell and start screaming as they were going up to the Union troops. And the Union troops, they freaked out. A lot of them dropped their weapons and just ran back to Washington, D.C. While all this is going on, there was a bunch of people that took little rides down to watch this battle from Washington, D.C. They had picnic lunches, and they were sitting up on the hill. They were like, oh, we're just going to watch this battle. Little did they know they weren't going to be able to see anything because of all the smoke that came out from the guns. Also, when the Confederate troops started doing that rebel yell and chasing after the Union troops fled. They ran back like as fast as they could and basically trampled over all of those people that were there to watch the battle. Here's a map showing you how close Manassas was to Washington, D.C. I mean, if you look at the map, the Southern capital and the Union capital are pretty close to each other. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? Now, this battle, the Battle of Antietam, or some call it Sharpsburg, was in Maryland. Again, pretty close to where Washington, D.C. is. It took place on September 17th, 1862 at Antietam Creek near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. General Robert E. Lee tried to invade the North. It was the deadliest one-day battle in all of American military history, even up through today. I mean, there were so many people that died in this single day that I read of accounts where people were walking in the dirt, which turned into mud from all the blood that was shed there. Um, it really, really was a devastating battle. There was so much loss of life. The North took it as a victory, even though both sides lost a tremendous amount of lives. This gave Lincoln the chance to put out the Emancipation Proclamation. That was a very important document because it got people in the North fired up. Because up until this point, the South was crushing the North in pretty much every battle. In that document, it says all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. So basically, Lincoln is saying if you're in a state that seceded, your slaves are free. Now, think about this. Do you think any Southern state is going to listen to what Lincoln says? Why wouldn't they listen to him? Was he actually their president? These are some things you need to think about. So here's a couple pictures. We have some actual photographs of the aftermath. You can see some of the bodies down there in the bottom right-hand corner. And then you have these other photographs showing like how they had to line up the bodies. There were so many of them. It was devastating. I mean, it took years and years and years for Sharpsburg to rebuild.